In this video, we're going to look at the LZX Vidiot. The Vidiot is a standalone video synthesizer, and while it doesn't require any patching to operate, the real fun and complexity starts when you begin patching it. So now we'll look at a few basic patches to get you started. I'd highly suggest reading the entire manual for the Vidiot and playing a little bit with it unpatched before watching this video. To begin, let's take a quick look at the basic controls. At its core, the Vidiot has two video rate oscillators, as you can see here. These can be combined in different ways, and we can view different outputs: diamonds, hatches, circles. We also have a noise output, and on this side we have the Luma processor, which gives us controls over brightness and contrast. We can also set different inputs for the Luma processor. And of course we have a colorizer section, which allows us to add different red, green, and blue mixes. And we have two independent keyers. Of course, there's a lot more than that, but for this video, I'm going to assume you have an understanding of the basic controls on the Vidiot. So let's get started with our first patch. One very cool feature of Vidiot is it has an external audio input. This audio input goes to an envelope follower, which can then be used to modulate any aspect of the Vidiot. I'll push play on my drum machine, get a basic beat going. And now this ear output is going to allow me to take that signal into any part of my Vidiot. So one very simple thing I can do is take the ear output and go into frequency modulation on one of my oscillators. So this will start to give me some nice up and down movement. To make things a little bit more complex, I could take the sine wave output of this oscillator and use that to frequency modulate my second oscillator. Now one nice thing the Vidiot has, I could set this dial to just view the audio input. This gives me some nice color modulation. However, I can't view my pattern and my audio input at the same time. The way I'm going to work around this is by patching the Luma processor independently into the keyer for the color channel. To do that, I have to reach around the back of the Vidiot, where there's another I output. I'm going to plug that into my keyer. So now I'm taking the output from the Luma processor section and plugging that into my key threshold control. As you can see here, I have the Luma processor section set to my ear, but we're not going to see a very strong result. If I switch to just view my Luma processor, you can see this is what it looks like. To make this a little bit more interesting, I'm going to put a sine wave out from this oscillator into the contrast control. It's going to give me a little bit of an image mixed in with those flashing colors dictated by the music. I'll fine-tune my brightness control. So now I'm going to switch this back to my regular pattern. I'm going to turn the keyer on. And now, as you can see, if I take this out, it's just a basic shape. And if I take the output from the Luma processor section and plug that into my key threshold, start to get something a little more dynamic. So that's the basic patch. From here we can start to play with different options, different amounts of frequency modulation, and of course, different colors. Adjust our keyer threshold. Adjust the brightness and contrast of the Luma processor. And we could switch through our different basic patterns. We could also set this to, say, a triangle wave. Switch this one to a square wave. And there's your basic patch. Of course, you can patch this ear output into almost anything in the Vidiot, and you'll get some interesting results. This is just one example of how you can get started playing around with audio inputs. In this next patch, we're going to look at using an external video input as a modulation source. This is a less obvious use than, say, colorizing or just simply keying an external video, but it's capable of some pretty interesting results when used the right way. So here we can see an external video signal. This is being played off an Andor 1 media player, but you could also use the DVD player, video camera, anything with a composite output. So right now we're just looking at the video feed, going through the colorizer, basic black and white settings. Using the camera output on the Vidiot, I can start to take this and use it to modulate different things. So I'm going to go up just to look at our basic pattern here, black and white oscillators. I could take this camera output and use it to apply frequency modulation to my oscillators. This is going to work better with your vertical rate oscillator. And so for this oscillator, I really have two options. Do this, which looks pretty cool, or I could use the external video to actually sync the oscillator. So I want to make sure my sync button is pushed, and then I can plug this into my sync input. So I'm going to take the sine output, and I'm going to put that into the keyer on channel 2. That's going to give us a really clear indication of what's going on with this oscillator. I'm going to set this to noise, and start to adjust my color a little bit, and adjust my key settings. So now you can see here, the oscillator is syncing to just the brightest edges of the video input. But again, we could also do the same effect with frequency modulation. Just depends what you're going for. Both give very interesting results. Now if I want a little bit more control over this, I'm again going to use the Luma processor. So I'm going to unpatch this for a second. Make sure my Luma processor is set to camera. And then again, just like in the first video, I'm going to take the Luma processor output from the back of the Vidiot and then plug that into my sync. Now I can use these brightness and contrast controls, as well as the detail here, to fine-tune this result. So you'll notice immediately I'm getting a very different image. This just gives me one extra element of control. Now currently, my second oscillator isn't doing anything in the patch. So I'm going to take the triangle output, and I'm going to patch that into the negative control for my colorizer. And this starts to give me an additional image layer. Cool. And then finally, I'm going to introduce one more layer of feedback. I'm going to take one of the RGB outputs, it doesn't really matter which one, and plug that into the solarize input on my Luma processor. This is going to make things just a little bit more unstable and a little more intermodulated. As long as I jump through my different controls, I can get some wildly different results. And all the movement in this patch is being driven by that original input video signal. If I were to switch the incoming video to something different, I would get a very different result. I can also unsync this oscillator. And I could also take something like the hatch output and use that to frequency modulate this oscillator. And I'll just give it a little extra element of chaos. So this is a much less conventional way of patching in an external video. As always, with the Vidiot, don't be afraid to explore and experiment. In this last patch, we're going to look at combining several of the techniques we've already explored in this video, and look a little more closely at the keying features in the Vidiot. So again, I have an external video playing off the Andor 1 media player, which you can see on the screen now. I'm going to switch this over so we're viewing the output from the Luma processor. I'm going to adjust my levels so that we can see the signal. By default, the external video signal is always run directly into the Luma processor. This knob here simply controls what's going to be modulating these different parameters. So if I set this to noise, as it is now, and turn up my brightness, as you can see, the noise signal is now dictating the brightness of my image. Do the same with contrast. So that's going to give me some nice noisy fringes to my image. There are two separate ways to key the image from the Luma processor. You can either key the negative signal by switching the negative switch down to key, or you can key the solarized signal by switching the solarized down. In this example, we're going to look at the solarized version. We're going to come back to this image in a minute. But for now, I'd like to focus on what I'm going to have the two oscillators do. So I've switched this to the diamond output. Now we just see a very basic shape. So just like we did in the last patch, I'm going to take my camera output and put that into frequency modulation for my oscillator. That's just going to give me something a little bit more interesting to play with. So once again, I'm going to reach into the back to get the output from my Luma processor. And this time, I'm going to take that into the negative switch on my colorizer. And then I'm going to set this to key. So now as I adjust my key thresholds, you get to see a pretty cool complex effect. So I'm using both keyers. Keyer number 1 is keying her basic face shape. Keyer number 2 is keying based on the diamond shape that's being created by the combination of my two oscillators, but the key is being inverted based on the shape of her face. Now I can take my second oscillator and take the triangle output, and I can use that to modulate the second key. I can turn that all the way up. Then I can start to play around and find a color palette that I like. And start to adjust different values. And I can go back and play with my brightness and contrast, my CV amounts. And if I don't like the noise, I can swap that for other patterns. I can even go back to the camera itself, which will start to introduce some different effects. I'm going to keep that on noise for now. And then finally, for this patch, I'm going to bring my drum machine back. So I'm going to plug this in to the external audio input, push play, and then I can take that output from the envelope follower and put that anywhere on my patch. In this case, I'm going to go into the keyer on my Luma processor. And of course, I could use stack cables to take that to multiple destinations. I could even switch this from noise to my ear input. And let's try splitting the signal using a stack cable and put that into the modulation input on my second oscillator. So from here, you can play with a lot of the different switches, start to get a variety of different effects. So that should give you some idea of how to get started with patching your Vidiot. We hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, please leave any questions or ideas for future videos in the comments below. Thanks for watching.